Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're so glad that SUNY Plattsburgh was able to host us here for this discussion of water quality in Lake Champlain. It's a topic that Adirondack Explorer has been following closely for a while now, thanks to Zach here, our water reporter. We've had him since 2021, and so that's his beat. He covers water quality, and he's been writing for us print and online and facilitating conversations like tonight's. I'm glad to see so many of you here tonight that are working in this field as well. We have people from water experts to camp directors and ferry captains here in the audience with us. So we appreciate all the work that you all are doing too and the expertise that you're bringing to this conversation. And tonight's event was made possible in part with a grant from the Lake Champlain Basin Program. They've been funding an ongoing project around this topic that Zach's been working on. And I'd like to thank our sponsors who helped make this event possible, the Lake George Association and our presenting sponsor, the Adirondack Council. And they've been sponsoring the Explorer series of events over the past year. And representing the council tonight, we have Sunita Hallis. She's the council's clean water community advocate. Before joining the council this year, Sunita coordinated the Adirondack Climate Outreach and Resilience Network, also known as ACORN. And she's been conducting community climate resilience listening sessions throughout northern New York. So thank you, and thank you, Sunita.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you all so much for being here tonight. This is a super meaningful conversation I think we're about to have. As Melissa said, I'm Sunita Hallis. I'm the Clean Water Community Advocate, emphasis on clean water and community and advocate for the Adirondack Council. And we at the council are proud to be sponsoring this event because we know that when we come together to tackle these super thorny issues like the intersections of water quality, land use, runoff, and human and ecosystem health and safety, we all bring such a diverse and important range of perspectives and experiences, and this is essential for making water quality progress for Lake Champlain. So this panel this evening is a great opportunity to hear from so many of these diverse expert voices who represent a lot of the different key ways that we work together for Lake Champlain. And you, the audience, represent more expert voices. Actually, could we just have a show of hands of how many students are in the audience this evening? Awesome. I think there are 2 students right up front, too. But you guys are super important to be in the room, so thank you. It's also very special that we have leaders from both sides of the lake here with us tonight. So I really encourage us, as a person who loves community conversations and community listening sessions, I really encourage us to have a strong conversation together tonight. And philosophically, I want to say that when we come together like this, we really start tipping the scales toward human-made solutions instead of human-made problems. And I feel like clean, healthy water is a natural outcome of a healthy society and healthy relationships. And so caring for our water really is, in many ways, an act of democracy. And we can all play a part in that. So I'm hopeful that this event will move us forward for the lake, for our shared ecosystems, and in the ways that conservation builds community. And I would like to introduce my great friend and colleague, Zach Matson. Zach has been an environmental reporter for the Explorer since October 2021. He's focused on the many issues impacting water and the people and plants and wildlife that rely on water in the Adirondack Park. Zach has worked at daily newspapers in Missouri, Arizona, and New York for nearly a decade, and most recently he was the education reporter for the Daily Gazette in Schenectady. And Zach lives in Saranac with his family. And the other day, Zach was saying that I was like a gazelle in a china shop. And so I'm going to give it back to you and say, you're like a wise owl in a china shop. So give us some of your good wisdom, Zach. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Sunita. I did have a clock counting down for when I would have to take the microphone from her hand, but she came in just under the wire. So anyway, well, thanks to everyone who made it out tonight. I'm really glad that we could, have this conversation about, this beautiful lake that we all love here at SUNY Plattsburgh, an institution that does a lot of research into Lake Champlain, that has educated some of the folks up here today, and so thanks for hosting us. I think it's important to think about and to sort of just reflect on the fact that we do live in this shared watershed that is so expansive. When you're walking down Main Street in Lake Placid and looking at Mirror Lake, you don't necessarily think of yourself as being as a part of the Lake Champlain system, but you really are, and it's important for us to focus on the lakes and the ponds that are like in our backyard, the things that are closest to us. But it's also important to remember that we are part of these much larger systems that connect us from Montpelier all the way to Saranac Lake. So, that's what we're here to do tonight. We have a really good panel of experts here. I'm going to introduce them real quickly and then circle back to give them kind of more time to dive into it. Then we're going to have a discussion among ourselves, and then the last 30 minutes we'll take questions from the audience. So, if you have anything that you want to add from your own, background, or you have a question for these folks, please chime in. So, at the end we have Sue Hagar, who started a new position this summer as coordinator of the Champlain Watershed Improvement Coalition of New York, which is, she'll be working to support a lot of different types of projects on the New York side of the watershed. She started her environmental career at the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Agency, and more recently worked as an environmental educator with the Lake Champlain Basin Program. Next to her is Jenny Patterson. Jenny started as executive director of the Lake Champlain Committee in January, and the committee, which manages a massive lakeside harmful algal blooms monitoring program, is based in Burlington, but Jenny lives here in New York, in Chazy, and before joining the committee, Jenny spent over a decade as an environmental attorney in New Hampshire state government, so she also brings that perspective with her. Next to Jenny is Julie Silverman. She works as the Lake Champlain Lake Keeper with the Conservation Law Foundation, advocating on behalf of the lake. Prior to that position, Julie worked for the state of Vermont's Aquatic Invasive Species Program and spent nearly 20 years helping to build the program at ECHO, the Leahy Center for Lake Champlain, at the beautiful Burlington waterfront. Next to Julie is Brendan Wiltsey. Brendan is executive director of the Lake George Association, a position he's been in for about a year. But he's also worked throughout the Adirondack Park for a number of years, where his work has examined road salt pollution, harmful algal blooms, and other pollution challenges on hundreds of lakes across the Adirondack Park. Now he is focused on Lake George, the largest lake on New York side of the watershed. And then to my left here is Laura Kleiber. She's a research scientist with the William H. Minor Agricultural Research Institute in Chazy. The Minor Institute is a unique, really institute that studies and demonstrates best management practices on its fully operational dairy farm, where they have 500 cows as part of that operation. Her research focuses on nutrient management on dairy farms, how farm practices influence runoff. She just told me that she's finishing her dissertation for a PhD at UVM, where she's studying this exact topic: how do we manage farms to reduce runoff of phosphorus and other nutrients into nearby waterways. So we're really fortunate to have this group with us to talk this over. Let me just flip here. So here's a map of what we are talking about. And it's really interesting that the Adirondack Park, which the Explorer, is very obsessed with and very focused on, the Lake Champlain watershed and the state of Vermont are all roughly, the same size, around 8,500 square miles. And so they don't know it yet, but at the end of this, I'm going to have Brendan and Julie debate Lake George versus Lake Champlain. Yeah, exactly. So stay tuned for that. Brendan is contractually obligated to defend Lake George at all costs, so be careful. But in all seriousness, we're here tonight to talk about water quality in Lake Champlain, particularly the long-running efforts on both sides of the lake and in Quebec to control phosphorus in the lake. Phosphorus, which runs into the lake from anywhere and everywhere you can imagine, is a key nutrient contributing to the lake's harmful algal blooms that close beaches and detracts from the lake's many uses. For over 20 years, a federal pollution plan has targeted the amount of phosphorus the lake can take in from sources around the lake, and it's sort of broken into these different segments. If you look in the back of the room, you'll see this chart that sort of has these graphics of showing the phosphorus levels and whether or not they're meeting these certain targets for the different parts of the lake. So as you can see, it's a mixed bag where there has been progress, but really consistently, we're still falling short of these goals and these targets of what is considered sustainable for the lake. The number one contributor of phosphorus to the lake is farm runoff, particularly dairy operations in Vermont, and we'll get into more about that and some interesting developments that have been happening on the other side of the lake. But phosphorus, in soil sediments, and things as seemingly innocuous as road ditch erosion is another major part of this problem and a part of the potential solutions. Climate change, especially the torrential storms like what we saw in recent summers, is making the problem even harder to manage. So we're going to get into this with more from our panelists. Julie, let's start with you. As the water keeper, you spend a lot of time on the lake. Talk about why it is so important to control phosphorus and what impact the nutrient has on Lake Champlain if we fail to control it.
Dun, dun, dun. Well, first off, I spend almost, 2 to 3 days a week during the season on Lake Champlain. So I feel really honored and privileged to be one of those sort of boots on the ground people. I am always wet and dirty and mucky and stinky, many people say, because of the work that I do. And it's really in my heart and deeply embedded in everything that I do. And I think the recreational impacts, the economic impacts, the property value impacts, the health impacts, all of these things are really affected by what's happening in the health of our lake. It's a huge issue, we all know that. And we're really constantly thinking about what are the things that we can do every single day to make a difference. And it's a big part of my job to also be part of the monitoring program. So I work in conjunction with the Lake Champlain Committee, and I am able to take the monitoring to places that don't usually get monitored. So I monitor Law Island. I paddle over to Law Island every single week and do an active monitoring of that particular beach because it's a public access beach. We want to make sure that we really understand and have real-time scientific data and observations about what is happening every day if we could. If we could have that many volunteers out there doing the work, we would. But that's a really big part of my work. I also do phosphorus data collection through the lay monitoring program in the state of Vermont. So I'm engaged in data collection and have definitely, like everybody else, seen a lot of different trends. I grew up swimming in Lake Champlain since 1969, and I have definitely seen and experienced firsthand what that feels like. And I take phone calls and emails and Instagram messages and you name every other way people reach out to me and say, Julie, what is going on? So we have a lot of work to do. I think we'll talk about that, but the impacts, as we know, are really serious. And again, there's social impacts and environmental impacts and economic impacts to all of the cyanobacteria that we have and the issues that we have.
Great, thank you. So Sue, talk a little bit about your new position and sort of when we talk about the kind of work, the kind of projects that are needed to sort of help mitigate this runoff problem and this phosphorus loading, what does that look like?
So I have been working for we call the group QUICKNY, so the Champlain Watershed Improvement Coalition of New York, for about 90 business days. So it's fairly new. One of the first things that I have learned is that it's a really long drive to Washington County. The other thing that's been really interesting is that QUICKNY is a group that we have 5 soil and water conservation districts up and down Lake Champlain. So the region reaches from the Canadian border down past Whitehall. In each of those, we have, in addition to the soil and water conservation districts, we also have the water quality coordinating committees, as well as the Lake Champlain, Lake George Regional Planning Board. So that's the core voting member group of QUICKNY. We also have groups like the Ausable Freshwater Center, as well as BRASS, the Boquete River Association, who's part of our group as well as other state entities that sit in our meetings as well and help to advise. The one thing that QUICKNY really, or the couple of things that QUICKNY really is working to do is amongst those 5 different counties is to really work to have collaborative planning as well as implement projects that protect water quality. But the thing is we already have some phenomenal things that are going on to do that work. So if we look at things like, what does phosphorus control actually look like in the field? Well, for municipalities, that could be erosion control. That could be hydroseeding on the side of a road. It could be working on revegetating an area. It could be looking at how they can improve the ways that they are using salt on their roadways. That's really a big issue now. But it's also more than that, because you've got logging operations or managed woodlots. There's different types of projects that they can do, standards and regulation that they have to abide by to make sure that it's not impacting water quality, either by sediment or erosion or temperatures, right? But there's also a lot of things that landowners can do and farmers can do. So it's not that we don't have things that are going on. We have some phenomenal things that are going on right now. And it's something that everybody can get involved on every level. So it's not just all the big guys, and the big players in our region. It's your next door neighbor. They can really help to make a difference as well.
Yeah, and we'll get into it. So it is, such an expansive issue that it really does take, a lot of different participants. Brendan, talk about sort of what phosphorus trends you all are seeing in Lake George and sort of how you're thinking about this issue there, and then compare something like phosphorus control as like a challenge to a different topic we've talked a lot about in the past, road salt reduction.
So at the LGA, our approach to everything we do, we say is science to solutions, and for us that starts with the long-term monitoring data that exists on Lake Champlain, which goes back to on Lake George, which goes back to 1980, and currently that sort of is encapsulated in what we call the Jefferson Project, which is a partnership between us, RPI, and IBM Research to deploy rather sophisticated technology around the lake to understand what's happening really at high frequency in real time. And when we look at the issues facing Lake George, one of the top threats that we've identified is nutrient pollution, specifically phosphorus. The trends in Lake George are that total phosphorus has been relatively stable over that period of time since 1980. What is most concerning to us, though, is there's been a significant increase in soluble reactive phosphorus, which is a form of phosphorus that's more bioavailable to plankton in the lake. So it's why that trend's occurring, we don't fully understand. But the fact that the most available form of phosphorus is increasing in the lake is a real concern for us. We do know from work at the Jefferson Project that large storm events mobilize large amounts of that soluble reactive phosphorus, particularly in like the first flush that comes out of those storm events. And so a focus of ours, because we don't have a lot of agriculture in our watershed, we actually have quite limited development, really, when you look at it holistically, is controlling stormwater runoff from developed areas of the lake. But we're also recognized that a lot of that phosphorus could be coming from the forested portions of the watershed as well. Relative to road salt, I think this is a much more complicated issue because the sources of phosphorus are much more diverse than the sources of road salt. And what we need to do to control phosphorus, sort of the response to that is much more complicated than what we need to do on road salt as well. So it's, for us in our organization, I think over the coming decades, it is the biggest challenge that we face, figuring out how to control the rising concentrations of soluble reactive phosphorus and deal with changing storm events that we're experiencing in the area as well.
Right. Yeah, and these growing storms are really a huge concern here, and it is kind of incredible. The modeling that they do at RPI, you can see after these storm events, a flush of phosphorus enter the lake, and that is what is feeding these harmful algal blooms. So Jenny, the Lake Champlain Committee manages this lake-wide HABs monitoring program that provides real-time information about where HABs are and where they may pose a safety risk to the public. Why is that important, and what have these monitors been seeing when they go out into the field these last few years?
Thanks, Zach. I love talking about Lake Champlain Committee's cyanobacteria monitoring program because that's actually how I got involved with the Lake Champlain Committee, was as a volunteer monitor with the cyanobacteria monitoring program. So even though I grew up with Lake Champlain being the most important place to me and my family, and I was always trying to spend as much time here as I could, and I was doing environmental law and policy, I never quite got to do it here. And so I was excited to find out about this program, really because I wanted to learn more about the science. And so that's really the core of what Lake Champlain Committee does. We are a bi-state nonprofit. We engage in science-based advocacy on behalf of Lake Champlain. And we really started as a committee. So if you look at the watershed, it was New York, it was Vermont, and we were founded in 1963. So the cyanobacteria monitoring program, it extends throughout Lake Champlain. So in Vermont, our partners who help us with they operate the tracker on which our volunteers record their data. So it also does include some Vermont inland lakes, but the entirety of Lake Champlain is included in the tracker. And so what we do is we have close to 300 volunteers who we are training every year, and it's a very rigorous training. Again, for myself, I knew nothing about cyanobacteria. I learned so much by being involved in this program. And so we have designated sites, and the monitors commit to going out every week, and they categorize what they see by the conditions that they see. Back when this program was founded in 2002, there used to be sampling that took place, but it was ultimately converted to being based on photographs and the rigorous training of the volunteers on how to assess the conditions. And so basically it runs the gamut, and if there's a bloom, and I think you had some photos, Julie, but probably everybody has seen pictures of cyanobacteria. We've got some brochures over there if you want to see it, but maybe you don't. So a level 3 is a bloom, high alert bloom. There's yellow, which is a lower level bloom, and then there's blue, which is generally safe. So the tracker is available online to anybody who can go on the internet. And so it's really important to have the data be available in real time, both to the public, but also to the municipalities or the state parks or anyone else who may be, making a place available to the public, as Julie was talking about. So over the course of the season, every week people go out on our Lake Champlain Committee website. We post the emails that we send out every week, both to community members and also to monitors about the bloom conditions. And so you can see it's not in real time, as Julie said, like we don't have people who can go out every single day, but we do have people who are going out every week. And I think one of the real values of the data is to be able to track over time what's been happening. And so with 20 years of data, there's a lot of work that can be done to analyze what's going on. I think for me, when I started my monitoring, I do my monitoring at Pointe Roche State Park, and there are not as many monitors on the New York side traditionally. That's one of the things that I am really committed to doing in my role as executive director of Lake Champlain Committee, is just having more outreach to folks in New York State and more awareness, and that the tracker is there, that the Lake Champlain reports are there. But what have we been seeing over time? The blooms are starting earlier in the season. Our monitoring season now typically extends from early June into November. This is actually right now the very last week of the monitoring program, and on my computer I was getting bloom reports as I was leaving to come here. So we do operate that program with substantial and generous support from the Lake Champlain Basin program, and we have great partners with the Vermont Department of Health and the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and it's a great program. Again, for myself, I felt like I'd learned so much and was very supported in my ability to go out. The first time I went out to do my reporting, I looked and there was a teal bloom and there were people fishing over it, that deep bay at Pointe Roche, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I was still in the learning process, and I am still in the learning process, but the more that I learned, the more that I talked to people, so that just to increase awareness. And I think that's, in addition to the data and the real time and the data over time, I think engaging people in those conversations and increasing people's awareness is just a really important part of the program.
Thank you. Laura, help us understand the phosphorus cycle on farms. Why is it important? How does it cycle through farms? And what are some of the ways that the Miner Institute has found are effective at sort of managing and mitigating that runoff?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the sort of the nature of the phosphorus cycle is one of the things that makes it a really big challenge to handle now, now that we better understand the science. One of the key things with phosphorus is that it is really likely to attach to soil particles when that phosphorus is mixed into the soil. But where that's a fantastic thing generally when we're fertilizing our fields, but where that has become a problem is 20, 30, 50, 70 years ago, when we really first started applying nutrients in larger quantities to our fields, we didn't recognize the challenges and some of the issues that might come from over-applying phosphorus. There was mistakenly sort of an assumption that the soil was such a good filter for phosphorus that there really was no risk other than a financial loss at applying more phosphorus than was really going to be needed by your crop. And so now what we're facing is that phosphorus is still attached there to those soil particles. So essentially what we're dealing with in many cases is sort of a legacy of past management. And so what was done 50 years ago, maybe by the farmer's father or grandfather, or maybe by someone, completely separate, and we have a new farmer that's moved in and is facing some of these challenges, not because anything was ever done wrong according to our regulations, but because when the science was in its infancy, we were making decisions that we now recognize were not necessarily in the best interests of our farms. And a similar situation exists within the lake as well. So we talk about legacy phosphorus a lot, and so that's the legacy of those past decisions. And so whether that's the legacy phosphorus that we see in our field soils, or that we see in our road ditches, our stream banks, or within the bays, particularly the shallow bays of Lake Champlain itself, when we have certain conditions like calm waters, hot weather, we can see even if we didn't have any additional phosphorus being added into these systems, for at least some time, we might very well be seeing these same degree of algal blooms, because essentially all of those conditions are already in place to create that type of situation. And then sort of exacerbating that fact is that there's all sorts of new environmental situations that we're facing that wasn't necessarily there as well 50 years ago. So a warming climate, within the lake, what are all of some of these invasive species that we're seeing come in? Could that be how they're cycling within those lakes? Is that impacting what type of phosphorus forms we're seeing in the lakes? And so it's really from the field to the lake, a challenging issue to address, because again, we've been learning in real time here. And so the past 10, 20 years, we've made a lot of great strides. Farmers are farming quite a bit differently than they were sort of at the turn of the century, but with all of those sort of environmental factors that were already in place, we're sort of fighting an uphill battle there. So that's probably the biggest challenge I see.
So quickly, why is there so much phosphorus on these farms? Where is it coming from?
So in some cases, it would be because they were told to apply that. It's sort of like insurance applications. We know one thing, another challenge with phosphorus is that it is, particularly in the lake, it is the first limiting nutrient. And in our soils and our fields, it's also one of those first limiting factors that's going to limit the growth of our crops. So farmers, again, maybe 50 years ago, were told, make sure to get some extra phosphorus out there because we want to make sure we're not going to be limited. We know it's not going to wash away, so let's make sure we have it out there. Alternatively, we also might have some situations where, particularly when equipment looked a lot different than it does nowadays, transport might have been more difficult. Again, not recognizing some of the potential risks, we were applying more manure closer to home than we would be at the fields further away. And in some cases, that's, there's benefits to that. You're saving fuel, you're saving labor, saving road traffic, but again, leading to other consequences potentially.
And this is maybe a simple way to think about it, but I have a dairy farm operation. My cows create a lot of manure. That manure is very helpful to grow corn that I can feed my cows, and around we go.
Absolutely. And so one of the biggest, it's a regulation that all of our farms are faced with meeting, which is having enough land in order to apply the manure that they have every year. There's certainly opportunities where if a field is a very low fertility field, you can apply a little bit more to that field than you could apply to another field that was in that sort of optimum state. But it is, utilizing that livestock manure, we are incredibly fortunate to have. We hear a lot of talk about soil health, soil quality. That's not really something that a challenge that we face here nearly as much, because the livestock manure has so many more good things that come with it than your traditional commercial fertilizer that you would buy from the store or from the dealer.
So before we go on here, I made this chart, and if you ask Matt Vaughn, who's the lead scientist at the Basin program, he would say this is sort of simplistic, but basically this federal pollution plan that is approved by the Environmental Protection Agency and applies to both New York and Vermont sets these like targets by segment, but then you can add them up lake-wide. And so on the left here, you can see what these sort of goal numbers are, both for Vermont and New York. And then on the right, you can see what these actual loading figures are based on some long-term averages that the states do. And you can see the categories. Both states are above their targets. You can see how much agriculture contributes from each state. New York's biggest contributor is actually our forests and all this, sedimentation and erosion. So that is our phosphorus loading. So Jenny and Julie both represent organizations that in 2022 petitioned the EPA, sort of challenging Vermont's oversight of these dairy operations, sort of alleging that there was a breakdown among the state agencies that are responsible for regulating them, and that they had failed to permit the discharges on these what are called concentrated animal feeding operations. They said that Vermont falls short of its obligation, and actually EPA last year, basically agreed. So there's been some action. The legislature in May passed a law that sort of, set up some stakeholder engagement to develop basically the first CAFO permit for the state. So maybe the two of you can tackle this and sort of just kind of where does this stand? Why was it necessary to petition? I know this was before you started, Jenny, but I'm sure you've been briefed and are up to speed now. But why was it necessary to, challenge Vermont's regulations in these way, their oversight in this way, and where does it all stand currently?
Yes, and Julie's letting me take this one, but you can jump in if you want to. And this was one of the first things that I did get briefed on when I started in my role. And your graphic really illustrates why this is so important. To why agriculture, why Vermont. If you look at the target phosphorus standards that EPA set for Vermont in 2016, there was an evaluation of where the phosphorus was coming from. 69% was coming from Vermont, and 41, I think, percent of Vermont's load was coming from agriculture. So the target reductions are specific by sector, and agriculture is one of the areas where there need to be very, very substantial reductions in Vermont. So the petition that was filed in 2022 by Lake Champlain Committee, Conservation Law Foundation, and Vermont Natural Resources Council basically focused on the way in which Vermont was implementing the oversight of the permitting program for water discharges, specifically with respect to large farm operations, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, as they're known. And basically, the petition said, look, the environmental agency, the ANR, needs to be the one who's overseeing this program. They need to be the one who's going out and doing the inspections. They need to be the ones with the enforcement authority. That was not the way Vermont's program was structured. And so in 2024, just about a year ago, EPA agreed that there was a problem, that the Vermont legislature needed to act, needed to give that authority to the Agency of Natural Resources. And so there were a couple of bills that were considered in the Vermont legislature. One of them would have kind of wholesale taken all of the authority and given it to the ANR. The other one would have moved the concentrated animal feeding operations to the ANR, but kept some of the other oversight of farms with the Agency of Agriculture. And so in the end, the bill that was passed was the one that was kind of less extreme, didn't do everything that the environmental advocates had hoped it would do, but it actually was improved a lot in the process of the discussion that happened in the legislature. So it did create a stakeholder group. Those stakeholder sessions are, I think, about to start, and they will bring together members of the Agricultural Committee and environmental groups to just figure out how to address the issue of oversight. And I mean, it is really important for those folks who are going out and inspecting farms to have that understanding of agriculture. So, I mean, you can see both sides of the issue, absolutely. But where it comes to the large operations where there are substantial discharges that don't comply with the Federal Clean Water Act, that's the real focus of wanting to shift the authority. And so another thing that the bill that passed did that was good was it said the current standards that exist for CAFOs under federal law, those are going to remain the standards. So even if they get changed in the future by the federal government, that's what the standard is going to be. Because I think one of the things that's been challenging about the whole discussion in Vermont is the need for certainty, and the farmers need to understand what the standards are, and just getting to a place where everyone understands how the permitting scheme works is going to be very good. So there is a path forward in terms of timing of when the permits will come out, when the stakeholder group will give its recommendations, and that is underway, and I think it's going to be beneficial to have those conversations. So I don't know, Julie, if you have anything to add to that.
Now, are you guys finding, has the EPA remained engaged in this issue from your experience?
I can take that. Yes, is the short answer. Even through all of the changes in political climate, they're still very engaged with the Agency of Natural Resources in a dialogue back and forth to come up with a plan that will work. So they're still at the table,
Yeah.
which is great.
And what's the end game? Where do you guys hope to see this go in terms of we get to a place where there's a CAFO permit and they are going through and actually, conducting the necessary permitting of these farms and operations? And what then? How does that help us get to, mitigating this phosphorus challenge?
I mean, one way that I think it will help is if the folks from ANR are the ones who are actually administering the permits and they're the ones who are going out and doing the inspections so that they can see what's happening and not have to rely on information that's kind of coming secondhand through a different agency. That was one of the biggest issues, is it was going through too many kind of games of telephone. And I think that created some uncertainty both about what the standards were, what needed to be done to come into compliance, and just how the whole scheme worked. So I think having that certainty is going to be really helpful.
Right. And Laura, pulling you into this conversation, I mean, say a little bit more about, if I operate a dairy farm, what are the options? Like, what are these practices that would help me to sort of limit my phosphorus contribution?
Yeah, and so I would say, and just to tag on to the end, those CAFO permits are certainly all in place, and I don't think there's any effort to change those necessarily. It's more to do with sort of oversight is the adjustments that's being made. So just wanted to make sure that we didn't make anyone think that we have large farms out there that are going unpermitted, because they certainly are. And then
I don't know, in Vermont they don't have any. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that in New
New York there are
yes,
CAFO permits.
right.
Yeah.
And it's the same standard on both sides of the lake, but that is the issue in Vermont, is the permits haven't been issued.
oh, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I thought it was the same on both sides. Could you repeat the other?
In New York, where they are permitted, what does this look like operationally? What are these farmers actually? I know there's ways to inject manure rather than spread it. I know that there are certain, the way you store the manure, or are you spreading it in the winter or not the winter? Like, what does this actually look like on the ground in terms of what these operational practices for farmers are?
Yeah, I think you certainly just named a lot of them, and that's key to realize that a lot of these practices are already being incorporated onto our farms, and in many cases, or at least in the New York framework, at least, we have incorporated them into the regulatory framework so that farms are reporting which types of practices they're using, and if they are managing things well, utilizing enough of those practices. It gives them a little bit more flexibility operationally. And I think that's a great process because it allows farms to sort of realize what they're gaining by employing some of these practices. But so certain things like injecting manure, planting cover crops, all of these things are relatively simple, sort of theoretically, right? In practice, it's not all that difficult to achieve if conditions are perfect, if the environmental conditions are right, if the financial conditions are right. But where we have challenges with some of our farms is trying to figure out how to make that switch to, in many cases, or in some cases at least, a very different way of operating. And so it's actually interesting, you know, it's very, very common to hear people have concerns about the large farms rather than the small farms. But in many cases, what we see is that it's actually those large farms that are able to make some of those large capital investments. And so if you need, you know, a new planter or new manure application equipment that's going to be $500,000, $1 million, a small farm just cannot make that work. And so they're going to be left to, you know, certainly have some practices that they're able to take advantage of, but may not be able to utilize others. And so I think it can be a timing issue as well. Our weather is always certainly interesting in the fall, and so are we going to have a late summer, long-lasting summer where we can get those cover crops planted in the ground, and in that case, you know, we see really, really nice benefits, or did we have a wet spring? We're kind of getting pressed into the fall, and just logistically, the farms cannot take off that feed, harvest those crops for feed to have enough feed for their animals, as well as be able to get that cover crop planted in the ground. And so in some cases, it's trying to really understand how do we almost entirely redo the system. And in an economic climate that's extremely challenging, that is another large stress. You know, if we're struggling to put food on the table, that's not exactly when you decide that you're going to change the way you live your life. And so, you know, it's a situation like that in some cases where, you know, it may not even be, you know, have anything to do sort of with opinion, but with, you know, what do I feel I can actually do and make it to the end of the day, and make it to the end of the next day. And so,
in New York, a lot of the phosphorus comes from like this sediment runoff and erosion and things like this. And Brendan, you've told me that, you know, this is still early days, but that you guys are starting to look at some of the stormwater systems around Lake George. How does that relate to phosphorus, and like what is the sort of universe of options available to, you know, maybe a lake-wide effort to improve stormwater? Like, what could that look like?
Yeah, can you pull up your chart there? So
he's going to correct me.
No, I'm not going to correct you, but I think it's of the New York side of the basin there, when you look at those blocks for the Lake George Association and Lake George, you know, certainly, you know, also in Lake George, a lot of phosphorus coming from our forests. Our forests are mostly owned by New York State and the Forest Preserve. There's not really much we can do to turn that dial in terms of addressing this problem. So for our organization, we're really then look at where can we have effective influence, where are our resources or our partner resources gonna have the biggest return on investment in terms of the practices that they're gonna implement. So for us, the dial that we can turn really is and we don't have very much agriculture at all in the Lake George watershed, so it really is from those urban and wastewater sources. And on the urban side of things, we've begun and it launched several years ago, a low impact development certification program. And the goal of that program is quite ambitious. It is that we intercept every drop of runoff from the built environment in Lake George, specifically targeting redevelopment or new development projects, but really we need to do it everywhere. And we're working with our local municipalities to get this whole suite of practices. If folks are familiar with like LEED certification, Leadership in Energy Efficiency and Design for buildings, lid, low impact development is similar for any development practice relative to stormwater. You get points for doing basically the good things. We're working with our municipalities to get those practices written into our local laws. The town of Lake George will give folks a tax credit if you get lid certification on certain types of development in their municipality. And then we're proactively working with folks as they're developing projects in the watershed to encourage them, whether they're required to or would directly benefit from a tax credit, to implement these practices on their, as they're considering redevelopment and new development in the watershed. So, you know, again, for Lake George, that stormwater contribution is a significant source of phosphorus, and where we can have the most influence is the stuff that's coming from the built environment as opposed to the stuff that's coming out of our forests.
And Sue, in your 90 business days, I mean, in terms of the types of projects, what is needed? Like, what kinds of resources are needed? How can, you know, these soil and conservation districts or other people who can actually implement these projects, like, what types of resources do they need?
Well, let's take a look at some of the I hate to say problems, right? Because I like to solve problems, right? But some of the problems or situations that a lot of folks run into is, first of all, and it doesn't matter if it's a municipality or a landowner or a homeowner, is getting funding to implement change, right? That's always a challenge. One of the things that Quickney does is we try to help people find that money, regardless if it's a municipality or other groups. That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to make those connections. The other part of that is a lot of times there's a long process in some cases with permits or permitting processes, and some of those can be really challenging. And if it's someone that is new to that type of a situation, it's really kind of difficult to navigate that, especially if you're either a new landowner or a new homeowner. Sometimes you're not sure. For example, when I talk about homeowners, one of the things that Quickney has done is we've done a lot of septic workshops, right? So that people can understand, number one, how your septic system works, right? If that's what you're on, your own personal private septic system, but also too, what happens if it fails? And how to figure that out, but then what am I gonna do to replace it, right? So I don't know about you, but as a normal human, until I got my own septic, I really had no clue, right? Where do I even start with something like that? So those are some of the things that Quickney is looking to help people on all levels. The other thing is too, is that, and these are on the kind of the bigger scale when you're looking at municipal issues, is that, number one, political connections. Let's face it, that's part of the game of getting funding, right? The other part is a lot of times when you look at issues that, let's say a municipality has a culvert, and that culvert is failing. There's a lot of erosion. There's no way for any aquatic organisms to go through it. Well, you'd think it's not going to be a big project, but oh wait, we've got to have it pre-engineered before we actually even think about doing the work or getting the funding. So those are some of the challenges that come up during this process. Now, what's really great though is there's a lot of things that are already in play. Soil and water conservation districts, for example, are working with municipalities to do things like roadside erosion. Soil and water conservation districts are also, in some cases, being able to help fund some live edge plow or some salt solution financing on a small scale. We're not talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, but small amounts of money so that small municipalities could make the change. Right, because again, everything, it just keeps going back to that dollar thing, man. That's what kills you every time you try to make a change. The other thing that's really good though is that also too, both at state and local levels, we already have a lot of, I won't say regulation, it's standards and specifications. So that could be like we're talking about CAFOs, right? There's a whole set of ag standards. We want to talk about forestry. There's a whole set of best management practices that are involved in that as well. So I mean, there's a lot of really good things that are already in place, but what we try to do is make sure that we are there to assist, but we're also there to educate. Because without those two things, it really becomes difficult for any body or any group to really move forward on making an environmental change. And we all want to do that.
And one important thing I think to note is that a lot of these types of projects that we're talking about, they have these co-benefits of other, they can also help with flood mitigation or help with like other types of habitat restoration. I saw Colin Powers from the Bocat River Association here, and they just did something they called, strategic woody additions or beaver dam analogs, where they were kind of constructing these beaver dam-like things in, a stream, a wadable stream, and that helps to slow down water. It helps to recharge the local aquifer. It helps to mitigate flood and all of this, and it also keeps, some of that sediment and erosion on the landscape and prevents the phosphorus from getting into the systems and going further down.
Can I add
Yeah,
something?
add something.
I think just an important point for us all to remember and think about too is what the cost of not doing anything is. Lake George, we're really fortunate to have this exceptional water quality. The challenges we face on this issue are minor compared to Lake Champlain. That exceptional water quality drives a multi-billion-dollar tourism economy into our region. And if we don't keep it that way, the cost of that inaction is much more substantial than the cost of the actions that we need to take. And I don't say that lightly, because then when you come down to the individual property owner or the municipality, where to get those dollars is a very real challenge. But I think it's critical that we recognize and understand that if we don't protect clean water and keep it that way, the cost of turning the dial back, and I think the analogy between, we don't need to duke it out, but the analogy between Lake George and Lake Champlain is we fully recognize and believe firmly at Lake George that keeping our water the way it is the most cost-effective way of us moving forward, because if it gets to the point where we're dealing with challenges that Lake Champlain is facing, turning that dial back is going to cost us a lot more money than if we just keep the clean water that's in Lake George clean the way it is.
Right. And before, we're going to come to the audience in a minute, but one last thing I just want to touch on, are these harmful algal blooms? And they pop up a lot of places, and this summer, there were these blooms that forced beach closures in Mariah and Port Henry and Willsboro. I think there was a point in time for a few days in July when numerous beaches in Burlington were closed. And so, Julie, we've talked about sort of this often happens during the summer when people desperately want to go to the beach. What is the impact that having to close beaches has on our lake communities, and sort of why is it important to sort of keep that in mind as we talk about this issue?
I mean, raise your hand if you haven't been to the beach or you don't like to go to the beach, right? So beaches are critical for people recreationally, but also we have to remember that climate change is real, it's huge. Temperatures are warming. In our region, we still have plenty of places that don't have air conditioning, and we have to really recognize that fact. But this is also an environmental justice issue, is that if we don't have clean water and places for people to go and actually cool off in our ever-warming summers, we are disadvantaging a huge population of people. And so clean water is really a right for everyone, and it is access to clean water for everyone. And so it really is an issue that the luxury of having air conditioning is a luxury and a privilege. We kind of have to recognize that. And again, I never grew up with air conditioning because in Vermont, we just opened the windows. Mom would say, go out, lay in the grass, whatever. Well, those times are long gone. And it's also, it's a huge issue when we talk about, the impact on wildlife and the impact on people's health is a huge piece of it too. And, Jenny told the story about somebody fishing past the cyanobacteria, and I'm out monitoring all the time, and I see people swimming in it because they feel like they have to. Their parents are making decisions for their kids because their kids are they can't be at home because it's too hot. And if they don't have any place to go, where do they go? We don't want people making those decisions. We want to be able to have clean beaches and healthy places for people to recreate and to fish and to snorkel and to go play with frogs and to have your dog go swim in the lake and drink the water out of the lake, because that's what they do, and kids to be able to play in the sand, and if they get water splashed in their mouth or they're putting their hands in their mouth, that they're going to be okay. And it really comes down to that. And back to what you were saying, which is, we can't not spend the money to fix the problem. We can't afford to not do this. It really does, as Jenny was saying, takes everybody to do the work. We can't point fingers because that doesn't really get us anywhere down the road. But we just have to remember that that people don't have access to clean water, and that's a basic human right. And we need to sort of talk about it on that level and work together to solve that problem.
Great. Okay, all right. I can come up with more questions. That's what I'm here for, but I'm hoping that you guys have some questions in the audience. This gentleman here.
I actually have two questions, but I'm going to start off with a lot of discussion about the sources of phosphorus, a lot of emphasis on forest. I'm not a well-educated person, but I'm considerably knowledgeable. So why am I here in forest as being such a significant source of phosphorus? I mean, can you dumb it down for me to understand a little bit? Put a lot of emphasis on it.
I'm happy. I can take that.
Yeah, so the 101 version is perfect, I'm sure.
I would say two things. One, there's phosphorus on the land and in the soil, and there's a lot of forest. So when you get water runoff coming, off of or through those surfaces, it's going to mobilize some amount of phosphorus. So within at least, I can't speak specifically to the whole Lake Champlain basin, but within Lake George, we have a significant amount of forested land. During rain and runoff events, and the water moves over through that land, it's going to mobilize some amount of phosphorus out of that. So we can't ignore, it's important to acknowledge that that is a source. The question then is what can we do about it? So if it's a managed forest or the forest preserve, it sort of gets more nuanced in terms of how the forest is being managed, and you may have more direct runoff from, erosion and that sort of thing from a managed forest.
Logging.
But I think one thing that's important to understand about Lake Champlain is that Lake Champlain is uniquely affected by adjacent land uses because of the way that it's configured. So for every acre of water in the lake, it's drained by 17 acres of land. And by comparison, if you look at the Great Lakes, it's like 1.5 to 4 acres of land. So we just happen to have a lake that is uniquely affected by adjacent land uses. And again, speaking to Lake George in particular, yes, there's a lot of adjacent forested land. And in general, if you look at the percentages of where the phosphorus is coming from, with 69% coming from Vermont, and I think it's like 23 from New York, 8% from Quebec, then the process that EPA goes through as they kind of set the targets for phosphorus is to look at the different uses of the land. And so if you look on the New York side, just because of the size of the Adirondack Park, forestry, it creates a lot of the phosphorus just by percentage, just because so much of that land mass is forested. But if you look at Vermont, the targets that are set in Vermont, there are specific targets that were set in 2016 that are supposed to be met by 2036, and it's sector by sector. How are they doing? they are almost halfway through the time period, but they're only about a quarter of the way there in terms of making those reductions. So the pace needs to pick up in terms of the reductions.
And this confused me a lot too when I started this. And there is naturally occurring phosphorus, and then there are some forested lands that had been farmed in the past and were enriched. And if you think about sort of this erosion problem, and the phosphorus is bound up in the sediment, and if you have rapid erosion washing away a lot of it versus a more controlled sort of, because you're able to say seed it or have some kind of thing that is reducing or mitigating the erosion, you'll get less of that phosphorus runoff.
I'm just going to add too that we in Vermont have more dirt roads than paved roads. That hasn't changed. So you have to think about that those roads and those ditches are part of development, and as well as having best management practices for logging, they're also having very clear ways to work on not having a lot of erosion coming out of those forests. So that's part of that. But we have to remember that built environment isn't always just Plattsburgh and Burlington. It's that where we're putting roads in and how we're changing the contour of the water hydrology and where that water's going. And so again, dirt roads, and if they're not maintained properly, cause a lot of erosion in the water.
I'm a retired land use planner, and so I have a sense of a little better comprehension, and also the fact that on my piece of land that I built a log cabin on and came here to Plattsburgh State in 1975 and went to 4 years of college with no running water and electricity, because that's how we lived back then. Studied by kerosene lamp. That land that I owned was old pasture land, and when I think of that time frame of the 60s, when farms were really in decline around here, and all that has gone back into forested land, and that disturbance and the fact that the phosphorus is tied up in the soils and all these other disturbances that take place. I just couldn't put my finger on what was really occurring, and it's because, I'm sure because of the acreage aspect that you're talking about, and any kind of disturbance to the soil goes in as a contributor to that.
Yeah.
I appreciate hearing, so it's one of my takeaways from tonight's meeting is to be able to walk away and understand where these sources of phosphorus are, and with a better understanding of the phosphorus side. My second question, it pertains to on the dairy industry. We have large dairy cooperatives in the region. Are they doing anything to go ahead and to work with the farmers on this aspect of phosphorus loading?
And everyone turns to Laura.
The cooperatives themselves do some education work. I would say there's other support agencies, support groups, support agencies, support systems out there for farms to get some of that education. But I can say at the Minor Dairy Farm, we're part of the Agrimark Co-op in Chateauguay, and so every year they have their group of young farmers go around, visit different dairy regions in the Northeast to learn from folks like myself. I've presented to them about some of our drainage research. They go and learn about different, how to feed better, all sorts of different things. But as far as what the co-ops are doing, I would say it's less. It's a little bit of support, but more we see, the extension agencies, other folks like the Minor Institute having people go out in some sort of outreach capacity. But I think there is certainly more need for that. I think extension, as with sort of everything these days, is facing some budget cuts, and so are there enough extension agents out there? Do those extension agents have enough support for their continuing education in order to sort of learn and grow as sort of the technology and the principles are changing and growing, so that they can then take that information to the farmer, because it can be quite a bit to ask the farmers to try and be coming to these whether these types of events or scientific meetings or all those different various things to get that information when they still are out in the fields or in the barns for so long. So trying to get that information to them is, I think, is a bit of a shortcoming. There are resources out there like extension, but I definitely think that more of those, in order to support our farms as we're asking them to change and try and do new things that they don't have any experience with, is going to be critical to get both a willingness, a buy-in, and an acknowledgement that even if there's some stumbling blocks early on, that ultimately hopefully these are leading in the right direction, both for the ultimate farm sustainability, their profit margins, as well as the environment as a whole.
And could I follow up on that just a little bit
Yep.
too? So one of the things that's in place, that it's a voluntary program, it's called the Agricultural Environmental Management Program. Now that's something that's offered through the local soil and water conservation districts. It's kind of a 5-tier setup. The farmer will answer a questionnaire. That will be the tier 1. The second tier would be that a technician would come out to help him evaluate his property, make recommendations. There's another level where they do the actual implementation so that they can put in some best management practices, do some good conservation work on their site. And then on the last stage, there's the constantly looking back to see if the improvements that you've made or the changes that you've made have actually been effective. So it's reevaluated and then revisited. So, okay, nope, we've got to make a little bit more of a change. And that could apply to anything from dealing with manure management or storage, where livestock are located on a property in relation to either a body of water or stream. So there's some really good programming that is available. To implement it, yes, there would be a cost, but to have these services, to have a technician to come out to do the evaluations, those are at no cost to the farmer.
Great.
You're welcome.
Let's see. Did you have a question?
I did. I'm curious about long-term trends in the data. It seems like a lot of what we're talking about is sort of just snapshot days.
Mhm.
But, what's the 40-year view of this? Are we getting better or worse?
Right. Yeah. No. This is a good question. This is something like I kind of did a lot, and I had to ask this question basically this exact way to Matt Vaughn, who is the chief scientist with the and he said that really it's not, in order to sort of look at these trends, they have to, because there's a lot of as you could imagine, there's a lot of annual variability. If there's a really wet year, you're going to get a lot of phosphorus. If it's a very dry year, you're going to get a lot less phosphorus. So they do average these out over time, and those, what we showed earlier was sort of in 1990 was when they set those targets for the around 500, 600 total, and we're now above 900. These charts in the back are really the best way that the scientists like to look at it, where they're looking by segment, because these segments are all very different, and they sort of process the phosphorus differently. And so it's sort of a mixed bag, where there are some of these segments that are doing better over time, including some that are like on the New York side, Cumberland Bay, and some of the rivers, the Saranac and Great Chazy have seen improvement, but then there are some spots in particular that are like very challenging. Missisquoi Bay and St. Albans Bay, the northeast arm of the lake, are sort of, so that's a good question. And that is a question after like a few months of reporting on this, I still was kind of like, so what is the trend? Are we, doing better or worse? And I think, I don't know if any of you want to, yes, maybe jump in for me, Jenny.
You go first.
Sorry. Oh, is she on the microphone? Yeah.
Well, I didn't know if you were asking about phosphorus trends or about cyanobacteria blooms specifically. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was going to talk about cyanobacteria blooms, so I don't have to answer,
Yeah.
but I can. I mean, I'll let Laura go first on the phosphorus.
I just wanted to sort of refer back to what I had mentioned earlier on, talking about legacy phosphorus, where we, it was probably about 10, 15 years ago now, did some research where we took sediment cores from Missisquoi Bay, brought them back to the lab, and essentially exposed them to conditions that would be like a hot, dry summer, low oxygen, warmer temperatures. And what we saw there with just taking that sediment core, putting water, and removing oxygen was we would see conditions where we would lose that oxygen and start to see things where we would see algae blooms. And so it really is that, again, not to say that there's nothing coming in adding to the problem, but we are really facing a problem that is sort of there in the bay. And because that phosphorus in the late summer maybe might release from those sediments, it rises up into the water column, that algae might use it up. Then those algae die, they decompose, it goes back to the sediment and reattaches to the sediment. So rather than certain pollutants that might stay within the water column as the water slowly leaves the lake, those pollutants leave as well. It's quite a bit different most times with phosphorus, where that phosphorus really is, in most cases, not leaving the system. It's returning back to the sediments.
So to that point then, do the scientists look at this and say, if there were no net new phosphorus, we still have a huge problem for the next 30 years because of legacy phosphorus? Or does that burn through the system in a short time frame? Do we know yet?
I would say we don't necessarily know. There's, so many of these things are very situationally dependent, but I would say that in quite a few cases, we would, if we just turned off that phosphorus faucet, we would still be, probably, 10, 20 years. I'm not going to try and without my crystal ball, go too far, but we would, it certainly wouldn't be next year or the year after that problem kind of disappears. And so, that's one of the biggest challenges.
Well, and let's add on to that all of the flooding. And we really haven't talked about the climate change factor on this, and we have to remember that the intensity of these storms and the amount of water that is coming in, it's like fire hoses coming out of the sky about what it's doing to erosionary impacts and how much phosphorus is coming out with the soils, right? So, and the increase in temperature in the air and the increase in temperature in the water, right? So it all goes together. And it's not any one thing. And I think from a policy and legislation standpoint, which is, we know that we have a lot more to do. We've put some great laws in place. We have a lot more making sure that people are completely implementing all of the laws that we have out there. We know that there are lots of things that are sort of phasing in, but we have to really get at it. We have to hold our legislators accountable and our leadership accountable to get to it, right? Like, it's not that they're not doing the work. We just have lots of stuff that needs to happen. And we're halfway in, and we, as Jenny said, we're halfway in. We're almost at 2026. 2036 is 20 years. We're only a quarter of the way there in Vermont, and we've spent a quarter of the money. And we're halfway there in time. We're only a quarter of the way there in our goals, spending a quarter of the estimated amount of money that it's supposed to take us. So the math isn't meeting that. And we may have to make some adjustments for climate impacts when we're looking forward about what kind of policy and legislation that we need to address and what kind of things we need to tweak.
So, and also too, what I like with talking about treading, so one of the interesting things about everybody here on this panel, we have either worked with, been funded by, or worked for the Lake Champlain Basin Program. Now, the Lake Champlain Basin Program was created in the early 90s as part of the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act that was created by Congress. What that does is they add lots of very specific amount of money that is decided by Congress and only comes to our region for use on water quality issues and checking out and improving this total maximum daily loading, right? And our phosphorus, and our water quality, and cyanobacteria, right? And ecosystem issues from the Adirondack Mountains to the Green Mountains, up into the Canadian border, all the way down to Glens Falls. Now, every 4 years, they put out something called the Lake Champlain State of the Lake, an ecosystem indicator report. Now, I brought a bunch of those with me. They're on the table as you go out. Now, speaking of trends, they do have one section, and by the way, that big map that I have in the back, that's a figure from here in this report. But with this report, initially you look at 5 sections of the lake, right? You've got Missisquoi Bay, you've got the Northeast Arm, you have got Mallett's Bay, Main Lake, and South Lake, right? The only one that is showing a trend, because of the way that the data is running, is the Northeast Arm. So you're talking about all the stuff that's between the islands and Vermont, right? And that one has a vis beside it. Everything else, because there's so many, one year we have a flood, one year we have a drought, one year we have, you know, so those are all not showing a specific trend. But the really great thing about this report is that the data is collected from New York, Vermont, and Quebec in order to find out what's actually happening in all of those different regions, so that we can turn around and look at that one in the back and say, okay, Missisquoi Bay, it's a mess, right? It's been an exceedance on phosphorus loading forever. Yes, it's a high ag use area, but again, there's also a lot of legacy phosphorus as well. So I mean, it's really been, and I spent 6 years with the basin program. So this part is always really exciting to me, to look what those trends are and see what the changes are and if we are making any progress. But the great part is that because of them and the Special Designation Act, we do have funding that's available to help try and solve some of these problems that we have.
Yeah, I had a question about sort of building on the trend point. Right now, we're at a point where we're at a problem area, problem stage. We can't, it sounds like, even if we don't do anything, we keep steady, we're gonna keep going, it's gonna continue to be a problem. Is there any hope that it can turn around? That at some point in time, if all the regulatory bodies are able to sort of manage the laws and it gets implemented with the farms and with the different sources of that we can actually turn this around?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Julie, can this problem be solved?
Oh my gosh. I am an optimistic person by nature. And I will say that we made, what's that?
I'm sorry, I asked the question.
No, it's okay. No, and I would say that we made the problem, and I'm going to say we can fix the problem. That's all. I'm confident that we can make this better. I'm not sure if the kids in this room are going to see it go away, but I'm hoping that maybe their kids, that we can get there.
Yeah, Brendan.
I will just, not specific to this, but as a reminder that we have solved similarly significant environmental problems in the past. In the Adirondacks, acid rain was a really significant issue, and we passed amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1990, and the nitrogen deposition has been, plummeting in the Adirondacks as a result of that. In Lake George, we see that in our lakes. In Lake George, our nitrogen concentrations are going down because of the amendments to the Clean Air Act that happened in 1990. Our lakes are recovering in their pH and in many different ways. So, I think we need to remain hopeful that with the correct policies and regulations and support for these large environmental issues, not just phosphorus in Lake Champlain, but climate change and other really big issues, we've tackled problems of this magnitude in the past as a society and as communities, and we've been successful. And I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't think that we could solve these problems. I'd give up and walk away at this point. But yeah. I think we can address them. It's certainly a big challenge ahead, but I think we've done it in the past. We can do it again.
See, Jenny has something to add. I'm guessing she's also an optimist.
I am an optimist, but I think that's why the outreach and education is so important. And I think from the Lake Champlain Committee's perspective, involving as many people as possible in conversations and awareness about what's happening. One of the things that's reported on in this actual issue of the State of the Lake was a survey that was conducted. Lake Champlain Committee was part of it in terms of people within the basin, their feelings about the lake, and their understanding of how their actions contributed or didn't contribute to water quality problems. And it's really clear from that survey that people really, really care about Lake Champlain. They really love it. And they might really not know, and they might be eager to know ways that their own actions could have an impact. So things like not putting fertilizer on your lawn with phosphorus, the septic system that Sue was talking about, that's always something close to my heart. Believe it or not, ever since working in New Hampshire, I got to deal with a lot of people with failed septic systems, and it does have a huge impact, making resources available to people so they can have a proper septic system. That makes a big difference. Julie came with her fake dog poop, picking up the poop makes a big difference. All of that, there are things that people individually can do. Doesn't mean you don't need the advocacy, you don't need the data so that it can be science-based and persuasive, but it's not just the policy decisions. There are things that people can do by getting involved.
Okay. Colin, I think, did you have a question? We're going to
I
probably
do.
wrap up soon.
I'll keep it quick.
Yeah.
This is actually sort of a speed round question, so I'd like to hear from everybody. Given what we've heard about legacy phosphorus and the climate change, warming lake, intense rains, do you each think that the current EPA TMDLs are adequate, or should they be even lower? Go.
Oh, this is a good question. And actually, New York is moving towards potentially updating their TMDLs starting next year. So if Colin has an opinion, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for him to comment.
I'm not sure exactly whether I would say they are sufficient or insufficient, but I think it's important to not just make a goal just because we know that it's possible. We don't want to set our sights too low, but I also think that if we're really, there's no such thing as perfection or no losses in a natural system. And so if we're trying to go a little bit too far, a little bit too deep in how we're trying to attack this issue, whether we actually make that change at a faster rate, I wonder. And then also, whether we see then, okay, our goal is up here, because we've raised it up here, and now we're still, now it looks like we're failing by even more. And so that's where I think that would be one of my concerns, without giving you a solid answer.
I'm not going to give you a straight answer, I guess, either, other than to say that it's important with any natural resource management issue to have an adaptive and iterative process. So we should be constantly reevaluating these targets, our progress towards them, the efficacy of the management actions we're taking. And if the outcome of that iterative process is that we're not achieving our desired end state or goal or moving in that direction, then we need to reconsider, what policies and everything that we have in place that we're implementing to try to get us there. So I think it's really critical with any issue like this to have a constantly iterative, adaptive process to drive us towards the outcomes that we're looking to achieve.
I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's basically at this point we're halfway. We need like an audit. We need a full program audit and evaluation. What's working, what's not working, and really being clear, what haven't we implemented that we said we were going to implement? Like, let's just be straight up on the table, put out a timeline, say, look, we fell short on this thing, but we're doing okay on this one, and like get her done, you just get her done. Hold people accountable and move forward with it. And then, let's see where we are. Going back to that, we should have had regular audits. Vermont is behind 3 years on an audit that was supposed to have happened. Actually, it was set for 2021. It didn't happen. Legislation pushed it back to 2023, and it didn't happen then. And we need to actually get her done so that we know how to change what we need to change and move forward.
Good question. 3 things in answer. First, you always do have to reassess. And I'm thinking, Colin, I think you were there. There was a presentation to the New York Citizen Advisory Committee about winter phosphorus loading. And that really struck me, because when the phosphorus targets were created, they were created under the assumption that there was no phosphorus coming into the lake in the wintertime. And clearly that's not true. There's research being done that shows that phosphorus is coming in the wintertime. So do you need to continually reevaluate? Absolutely. At the same time, I get the, oh, well, we don't want the targets so high that we're demoralized because we're not meeting them. We need to be realistic. We need to be looking at the most cost-effective ways of getting reductions to not just the amount of money that's spent, but what's your bang for your buck in terms of phosphorus reductions. So I think you do need to hit the targets. You need to see whether they need to be changed.
Oh, I just got mine still. Okay. Colin, you always ask the best questions, I tell ya. So I really have to, it's hard to go last on things like this. But I really have to agree that I don't know that moving the target is necessarily the answer. It's all in the implementation, right? Because if you're not doing something well, if you're making a lousy widget, no matter how many widgets that you're supposed to make, you're still gonna have a really lousy widget, right? So even if we can't meet our goals now, and if we're not having an audit done, right, that's huge. If we're not looking to the future and being able to implement well, we can have half as much as a target. And it's not going to matter because we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing well. So I really think that doing the audit and really being able to say, okay, here's what this works, this does not, right? Because then you're spending all your money in places that aren't effective. Oh, gee, I'm broke, right? That's it. That's all I've got.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. If you have any other questions, I have this old reporter trick where if you want to ask one of them a question, just stand between them and the door, and you will be able to ask the question. So, but anyway, I appreciate you guys all coming out. I'm glad we could have this conversation. I know it got pretty wonky at times, but I think part of the, what we can do in the face of such a enormous challenge is to keep at it and to talk about it and to bring people like this together and you all together. So thanks so much, and hang around, chat a little bit. Thank you.